one thing which I think is very exciting is that there is now almost in every country a very strong critique against neoliberalism, and in many countries a kind of rediscovery of the state. Of course, the state in China was always there, but here it was almost completely disappeared, and now it's coming back. So maybe that will enable us again to think about certain issues and to plan certain issues that through neoliberalism we couldn't even begin to think about. I hate the word deglobalization because I think there were many things wrong with the way we experienced and practiced globalization, but I think the essential point of it, which was to exchange and between different cultures, between different political systems, and to kind of basically, have a sense that the world is a single entity, kind of rather than a kind of fragmented situation. For me, that remains a very crucial point, and that is also, I am 100% sure, if we want to do something about the world, globalization, and about global warming, then globalization is a duty almost. And so I think that we will probably do it by slightly different means. Maybe we will travel less, but also my recent experience, I've been teaching in Nairobi in Kenya, I've been teaching at CAFA in Beijing, I've been teaching in Russia. That kind of exchange is for me a kind of really crucial role, even for architecture, because it's very interesting that diplomacy is not very efficient right now, and that is why a profession like architecture can actually have a kind of very important role. So basically we did an exhibition on the countryside, and what we did is we visited unique situations in every continent and many different countries, and then tried to find in those situations kind of people who could describe the situation or write about the situation. So actually it is not kind of basically my vision, but what I did is almost find an orchestra of different kind of Chinese people, of African people, of Russian people, that basically describe together, what is going on kind of right now in the world in situations that do not receive a lot of attention. That was the main point. And so it's really only a beginning, but what made the whole thing for me particularly urgent is this kind of idea that in 2050, only in 30 years, maybe 70 or 80% of all people will live in cities, and that would mean that the people who now live in the countryside would be halved. And I think that is such a kind of totally crazy idea, and I think that the consequences of the development have not been kind of thought through almost by any political system yet. That in addition to all this kind of reporting of what is going on, that is for me the greatest drive and the greatest urgency to simply show to the world how crazy and how unthinkable that is. But of course, for me the temptation is large to say that one of the effects of COVID is that it has made the countryside more important and the kind of status of the countryside and how we use the countryside more important. That was something that I was interested in before, but I think that through COVID it's become a more urgent question. One thing we discovered in China is that in America all the big tech companies are of course about making profits, and what I find interesting in China is that a company like Alibaba is also mobilized by the state to also create Taobao villages and to have a kind of more deeper involvement in potentially improving specific situations. So in that sense, and that is also why I've I've invested so much time, but also so much, let's say, intellectual capital in China, because I think that, you know, in many ways, China is a kind of important, very important country, not only for China, but also for us. Of course, there is other surprises, how quickly China has been able to make places that only 10 years ago were inaccessible, accessible, and the kind of incredible differences that is creating. And that was actually, you know, kind of something that I literally could not imagine, kind of based on my experience here, that you could do so much infrastructure in kind of such a radical way in such a short time. And so therefore it's very interesting for me to see, you know, what the effect will be of that massive infrastructure on the kind of small texture and narrow texture of delicate texture of Chinese countryside. I'm very interested in kind of architecture that actually is creating new kinds of facilities and new kinds of necessities that in certain ways are becoming too big for our cities, and finding both a language and a kind of location and a kind of reason for them. Yeah? Whether it's data centers or storage centers, I think there's a whole series of new topologies that, you know, are not formally part of the architectural commission. And there are also buildings that are not necessarily inhabited by human beings, but that are nevertheless crucial for our society. So I'm trying to understand what you could do with them as an architect, and also trying to find a way, perhaps, to make them not only exploit resources, but to contribute. I was in a way lucky, because the moment I started kind of working in architecture, it was very, very close that period of power in architecture was over. You know, I started maybe in kind of in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and you know, you saw that kind of maybe in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, architecture had been kind of very important domain, but you could see this kind of weakening from the very beginning of my career. So I've been a witness to it and also a kind of participant to it, but I think that through writing, through kind of conceptual efforts, through kind of involvement in politics, it's not that we regained power, but we also found other sources of power. I think there has been kind of simply an almost uncontrollable trend toward larger scale. And of course, as more and more political systems were dictated by the market economy, the whole idea that you could control that by the traditional means has become kind of simply thrown out of the window. Nevertheless, I still think that there is maybe it's a nostalgia for control, or maybe people from time to time discover that the absence of control creates really very serious problems, and therefore I feel that there is a kind of maybe similar to the fact that the neoliberalism is now no longer the kind of holy cow it has been for a long time. I think that therefore different forms of control will probably also make a comeback. In our country, for instance, there is a kind of serious system issue that we have let the level of the groundwater kind of go down and down and down. Nobody was alarmed by it, but actually now kind of buildings are beginning to tilt or to collapse. So that kind of control, we have to kind of reinvent it and kind of reinsert it. Yeah. Because it's obviously a city that has undergone an incredible transformation. And I think that the kind of most important thing for Beijing to do is to kind of maintain the presence of all those different Beijings. So you know perhaps that we did some kind of efforts or some kind of conceptual ideas about preservation in Beijing. I think it's very important that not every old part is scraped, but I also think it's equally important that not every new part is disliked. And actually the model of Beijing, which is kind of an old core and then all these kind of rings around it, expressed by the ring roads, is in itself a kind of very strong topology where if you're really interested in history and in the future together, you can kind of basically make all those moments coexist. In a way, I would have a tendency to look at the countryside more and to look at different aspects. Maybe that we're actually teaching at CAFA this year again to further deepen our kind of understanding of Chinese countryside. So that might be one thing, but I also like the formula diversified coexistence. Because I don't know whether you know, but for the Pearl River Delta, at some point created a kind of model or defined a model, exacerbated difference. So I think it's actually quite close. And I think it could contribute interesting new angles to understanding Beijing and to understand China.